There are moments in history when humanity drifts into a kind of waking sleep. A fog settles over the collective mind. Voices grow louder, yet thought grows weaker. Information multiplies, yet wisdom evaporates. And what emerges is something Carl Jung warned about long before the digital age. A mass psychological phenomenon the modern world now calls collective stupidity. It is not an insult. It is a condition, a state of mind created when people surrender their inner clarity to the noise of the crowd, a moment when independent thought dissolves into emotional reactions, and when the mind stops questioning, because questioning feels harder than joining the chorus. Jung understood that a person alone can be intelligent, but a crowd, even a digital crowd, is often not. Not because individuals lose their intellect, but because they lose themselves. This video explores how society arrived at a point where critical thinking is no longer the norm but the exception, where people react instead of reflect, accept instead of analyze, and follow instead of understand. It explores the psychological machinery behind the rise of collective stupidity, why the world is drifting toward it, and how each person can reclaim the quiet rebellion of thinking for themselves. The collapse of critical thinking is not sudden. It is slow, quiet, almost invisible. It begins the moment people stop questioning and start accepting whatever feels easiest. And in a world driven by speed, convenience becomes the enemy of understanding. Critical thinking requires effort. It demands reflection. It asks the individual to pause, observe, analyze, and evaluate. But today, pausing feels unnatural. Silence feels uncomfortable, and so the mind grows restless, desperate for stimulation, not insight. The result is a culture that prefers certainty over truth, simplicity over accuracy, and noise over wisdom. People no longer search for what is real. They search for what is easy to consume, what confirms their beliefs, what aligns with their emotions. This is how collective stupidity rises, not through ignorance, but through the abandonment of reflection. The digital world has accelerated this collapse. Algorithms do not reward thinking. They reward reaction, outrage, impulse. The content that spreads the fastest is not the content that enlightens, but the content that provokes. And so a strange thing happens. People begin to confuse attention with intelligence. They assume that popularity equals truth. They mistake confidence for competence, volume for authority, engagement for insight. In such an environment, the thinker becomes the outsider, the reflective mind becomes the minority, and the individual who still questions, analyzes, and doubts is seen as inconvenient. Yet this collapse is not only digital, it is psychological. When a society becomes overwhelmed, stressed, anxious, and overstimulated, it retreats into emotional reasoning. People begin to think not with their minds, but with their wounds, not with logic, but with fear, not with clarity, but with exhaustion. Under such pressure, critical thinking becomes a luxury many feel they cannot afford. People begin repeating ideas they have never examined. They defend beliefs they have never questioned. They adopt opinions that were handed to them, not chosen by them. And slowly, thought becomes imitation. Understanding becomes repetition. Dialogue becomes conflict. This is how collective stupidity spreads, one unexamined belief at a time. But the collapse of critical thinking is not merely a crisis of the intellect, it is a crisis of the self. A person who cannot think for themselves becomes vulnerable, easily manipulated, easily distracted, easily controlled, and the individual who cannot reason becomes dependent on the crowd, seeking direction not from inner clarity, but from external noise. Carl Jung warned of this phenomenon. He believed that when a person loses their individuality, they regress. They fall into what he called the collective unconscious, a place of unexamined impulses and inherited beliefs. In such a state, people do not act, they react. They do not choose, they follow. They do not grow, they repeat. The collapse of critical thinking is the collapse of inner sovereignty. And without sovereignty, the human being becomes like a leaf in the wind, moved not by intention, but by whatever force blows strongest. This is why the world feels chaotic, why misinformation spreads faster than clarity, why people shout more than they listen, why certainty feels more comfortable than truth. The collapse of critical thinking is not an accident. It is the natural consequence of a society that values speed over depth, reaction over reflection, and sensation over understanding. And unless the individual learns to reclaim their mind, the collective will continue to descend into confusion, noise, and intellectual fragility. But collapse is not the end. Collapse is the awakening before the reconstruction, and from here, the path forward begins. Stupidity does not become normal all at once. It is normalized slowly, quietly, and socially until people no longer recognize it for what it is. The normalization begins when society begins rewarding behavior that is shallow, impulsive, and unexamined. When loudness is praised more than clarity, when speed is valued more than accuracy, when entertainment is prioritized over truth. In such a world, thinking becomes optional, and distraction becomes the new default. Society normalizes stupidity through repetition. When a message is repeated often enough, people stop questioning it, not because they agree, but because they grow tired. Mental fatigue replaces mental effort. This is how nonsense becomes familiar and familiarity becomes accepted. Another way society normalizes stupidity is through social pressure. People fear being the one who sees differently, believes differently, or questions what everyone else is comfortable accepting. Conformity becomes more important than truth. The individual who raises a critical question is labeled difficult. The person who refuses to repeat what everyone else is saying is considered strange, even suspicious, and slowly silence replaces thought. But society also normalizes stupidity through its institutions, the systems people trust without examining. Education systems teach people what to think, not how to think. News cycles reward speed over understanding. Digital platforms elevate whatever generates the strongest emotional reaction, and in this environment, reflection begins to feel like an inconvenience. When people become overwhelmed by complexity, they gravitate towards simple narratives, even when those narratives are wrong. They prefer easy villains, simple explanations, and emotional certainty. They avoid nuance, because nuance requires effort. This is why entire cultures can drift into intellectual apathy without realizing it. Another force behind normalization is entertainment. Modern media blurs the line between knowledge and spectacle. People begin consuming information the same way they consume entertainment, quickly, passively, uncritically. The goal is no longer to understand, but to feel stimulated. And so, stupidity is not seen as a failure. It is seen as harmless, even fashionable. But Jung warned of this phenomenon long before the digital age. He believed that when a society disconnects from deep reflection, it regresses into what he called mass-mindedness, a state where the crowd becomes more influential than the individual. In mass-minded societies, a person does not think. They imitate. They do not evaluate. They absorb. They do not question. They conform. And what the group normalizes, the individual internalizes. This is how stupidity spreads. Not through intention, but through imitation. People copy behaviors that appear socially rewarded. They adopt opinions that feel socially safe. They echo thoughts that win social approval. Before long, mediocrity becomes the cultural baseline. Intellectual laziness becomes a shared language, and thinking for oneself becomes a lost art. But the most dangerous normalization happens when society begins confusing emotional comfort with truth. People avoid ideas that challenge them. They reject facts that discomfort them. They silence voices that unsettle them. And so, stupidity becomes a shield, a way to avoid complexity, avoid accountability, avoid growth. Instead of asking, "Is this true?" people ask, "Does this make me feel good?" Or, "Does this align with what my group believes?" Or worst of all, "Will this help me fit in?" Once society reaches this point, stupidity is no longer a deviation. It becomes the cultural norm. Yet even in such a world, thinking does not disappear. It simply retreats to the margins, waiting for those willing to reclaim it. because the moment society normalizes stupidity, the individual who chooses to think becomes revolutionary, and change begins with the one mind willing to see clearly in a world that prefers to remain comfortable. Protecting yourself from collective stupidity is not a matter of intelligence, it is a matter of awareness, a matter of courage, and a matter of conscious, deliberate inner discipline. The first protection is developing the ability to pause before reacting. Collective stupidity thrives on emotional impulses, the quick reaction, the fast judgment, the unexamined opinion. But the moment a person chooses to pause, even for a breath, they step outside the current, pulling everyone else. Jung believed that the individual begins the moment they learn to separate their reactions from the reactions of the group. The second protection is to cultivate solitude, not loneliness, but solitude, a place where the mind can hear itself again, a place where thought is not interrupted by noise, by opinions, by pressure. In solitude, the mind reclaims its strength. It detoxes from the collective mind. It relearns how to think instead of imitate. The third protection is intentional information discipline. Not everything that is loud deserves attention. Not everything that is repeated deserves belief. People protect themselves by curating what they allow into their minds. They choose depth over novelty, clarity over outrage, substance over stimulation. They recognize that every piece of information they consume shapes their inner world. The fourth protection is learning to sit with complexity. Collective stupidity thrives on oversimplification. It offers easy villains, easy heroes, easy answers. But real life is rarely simple. Truth is rarely comfortable. Wisdom is rarely effortless. The person who embraces complexity, who resists the urge for quick conclusions, is already stepping outside the collective fog. The fifth protection is emotional regulation. Collective stupidity feeds on emotional chaos, anger, fear, envy, outrage. It makes people reactive, tribal, and irrational. When a person develops the ability to observe their emotions rather than be controlled by them, they break the spell. Emotional clarity becomes intellectual clarity. The sixth protection is reclaiming the lost skill of questioning. Not cynical questioning, but conscious questioning. Is this true? Who benefits if I believe this? What evidence supports this? Does this withstand scrutiny? These questions act like light in a dark room, revealing the shape of things that would otherwise remain hidden. The seventh protection is cultivating the courage to stand alone. Collective stupidity is powerful because it is comforting. It offers belonging. It offers simplicity. It offers the illusion of certainty. To resist it is to risk being misunderstood, sometimes even ridiculed. But Jung taught that the path to individuation requires moral independence, the willingness to see, even when others choose not to. The eighth protection is building relationships with people who value thinking, not people who merely agree with you, but people who challenge you, sharpen you, and help you remain intellectually awake. A thoughtful community is a shield, a reflective friendship is armor, a truthful conversation is medicine. The ninth protection is living with intention. Collective stupidity pulls people who drift, who operate on autopilot, who move through life unconsciously. But conscious living, choosing one's values, one's focus, one's direction, breaks the gravitational pull of the collective. The 10th and final protection is humility. Not the humility that denies your strengths, but the humility that recognizes the limits of your knowledge. Humility keeps the mind open. It prevents the ego from becoming rigid. It keeps the individual in a state of inquiry rather than dogma. For Jung, humility was the doorway to wisdom, because only a humble mind continues to grow. In a world where stupidity becomes normalized, where the collective mind becomes louder than the individual mind, the greatest act of resistance is to remain awake, to think, to question, to feel deeply, to see clearly. This is how a person protects themselves, not by fighting the collective, but by refusing to surrender their inner clarity. In doing so, they become a rare presence, a conscious individual in an unconscious world, and it is from such individuals that the renewal of society begins.